right, well, it's 5:31. Let's get started. The meeting is ready to roll. Hello, welcome. I'm Shannon Gilmore, Executive Director of the Lincoln County Historical Association, and with my friend Jody Batchelder of the Old Bristol Historical Society, I am thrilled to welcome you to this lecture co-hosted by our organizations tonight. I'd like to start by also thanking J. Edward Knight and Company Insurance, who has been a sponsor and whose longstanding commitment to our community has made this possible. Along with the support of all of you who sent in donations tonight, your support, no matter the size, does make a real impact. If you haven't given and you'd like to, those are our two websites right there. It's not in the cards for you, that's okay too. We're happy to host this free and open to the public. Coming up next for us at LCHA is an online talk with James Tanzer on February 27th. He will talk about the help from Hampton in service at the Pownellboro Courthouse, about 4 young Black workers from Hampton, Virginia, who lived and worked in Dresden at the courthouse over a 20-year period between 1872 and 1892. And then we're back together with OBHS again on March 6th, 1 month from tonight at 5:30 p.m. We'll hear from David Greenham about Maine's German POW camps during World War II. We hope to see you at all of these talks, and you can look for registration information on our website or on Facebook. However you found out about tonight's lecture, then you can probably find the same information about what's next. For tonight's presentation, we have saved time for Q&A at the end of the program. If you have questions during the talk, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll share as many as time allows at the end of the program. And yes, many have asked, this is being recorded, and we will automatically email you and let you know when it's available for online viewing. That's all from me tonight. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see you here. I'm going to now pass off to Jody Batchelder, who's the Vice Chair of the Board at Old Bristol Historical Society. She'll introduce our speaker. Thanks, Jody.
Thank you, Shannon. And once again, we are so excited to partner with Lincoln County Historical Association. It's really fun collaboration. If you're not in Maine, you might not realize we're in the middle of a snowstorm tonight. And Shannon and I both live in Brunswick, and we often lose power during a snowstorm. So we just wanted to say that if things go completely all of a sudden blank, that means we've lost our power. We did talk about a contingency plan if that happens. We'll reschedule it for next Thursday, the 13th at the same time, 5:30, and you will get a message from us. And we apologize in advance if that does happen. The storm is kind of winding down, so we're pretty confident that won't happen. I'm really excited to have Carol back for another OBHS presentation. She did a talk for us about her previous book. I have it here, The Involuntary American, A Scottish Prisoner's Journey to the New World. And that's the story of Scottish prisoners of war who were forced into indentured servitude and brought to New England to work here, many of whom worked and lived in Maine and stayed here. It's a fascinating story, so I hope you'll check that out as well. She gave a talk for us last fall, which is recorded, and it's on our website. You can find it under our resources tab as well. So you can check that out too. So as I said, we're so excited to have her back. And we're getting a preview. This is very special because her book hasn't been published yet. We know that you've read her biography either in the newspaper or however you found this information. So I won't go into all of that, but I do want to highlight that Carol is an award-winning author, and she has been writing for over 30 years. She earned her PhD from the Johns Hopkins University and then went on to be a professor at 3 different universities. And she's published just a wide variety of both nonfiction and fiction pieces, as well as being a journalist and a food critic. So she has quite a varied background. The Divided North is, I believe, Carol, your second narrative nonfiction book. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct.
All right. And Carol will be having a book launch at the Maine Historical Society in Portland on May 15th. So please put that in your calendar. You can go to Portland and you can help her launch her book. We hope you'll join her there. So that's enough for me. Welcome, Carol. Thanks again for being here.
Well, thanks so much, Joey. I really appreciate that. And Shannon too. Thank you both for inviting me. So yeah, so I'm going to jump right in. Okay. And the question I have is, what did it mean? Oh, am I sharing my screen yet?
Nope, let's have you, I think you should be able to if you.
Let's do that. Wait a second.
I will say there's over 150 people here on the Zoom tonight. Thank you everyone for coming.
Great. Can you
And
see it
Carol.
now?
Not yet, Carol. Let's see if I need to change anything.
Okay. It's up on my screen and I to put share on, so.
You want to try once more?
Well,
Great, let me see. We see your screen now.
but do you see the whole image or you just see the?
I see everything, including, the
All
presenter
right,
notes.
let's put that. How's that?
That's perfect.
Image? All right.
Thank you.
Okay, we're all set to start then. Sorry about that little glitch. So as I was asking, what did it mean to live in a so-called free state like Maine during the 19th century? Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about life from the perspectives of two families from Maine, one white and one black. The Gordons and the Rubies of Portland were neighbors, contemporaries. They attended church and school together, but they were worlds apart. They were separated by their political beliefs, their family cultures, and their race. Now, the 19th century was turbulent, of course, across the United States, and slavery was behind a good deal of the unrest. And indeed, this picture here is an image of a pro-slavery riot in 1837, not in Maine, but in another free state, Illinois. But at this riot, a man from Maine named Elijah Lovejoy was killed for publishing an abolitionist newspaper. So you can see that the stakes at the time were pretty high. Let's focus on Maine itself. Here we have federal census statistics on our African-American population over time. And you can see that it never reached 1% until recently, okay? Because Maine has traditionally been so white, I think it's been an excuse to write off our Black history, to assume that our small African-American communities have had little impact, or that white Mainers have had no real contact with or knowledge of people of African heritage, let alone slavery. The truth is that Maine's maritime trade, its main economic engine in the 19th century, was well integrated, as was the nation's. Blacks comprised 1/5 of all US merchant sailors in the 19th century. And throughout the first 3/4 of the 19th century, Black stevedores controlled the Portland docks. Okay, so no ships, crews, or passengers could leave or enter Portland by ship without encountering people of African heritage. Now, we all know that Maine was a so-called free state during most of the 19th century. But I'd like to go back and just say that slavery existed in virtually all of the original English colonies at one time or another. And here are some examples of slavery in Maine. In 1663, 2 Africans enslaved by Captain Brian Pendleton of Saco died in a fire, and an inquest was held. The case appears in Maine's earliest court records, and that tells us that those of African descent have inhabited Maine, or Wabanaki land, as long as those of European descent have. Okay. The wealthy Shapley family of York County enslaved quite a few individuals, including an African man whom they named Will. Well, Will was eventually freed, and his son, Black Will, or William Black Jr., was the first non-native settler on what is now Bailey Island. You can see this is the map here. In fact, the island was once known as Will's Island, and the strait between it and Orr's Island, spanned by the famous Cribstone Bridge, is still known as Will's Gut. Now, Will's direct descendants, the Blacks, still live on Bailey and Orr's Island. And I know this because my family is from there too. So In the 1780s, Parson McLean of Bristol enslaved a young black girl, and he sent her out to fetch in his cows on a cold wintry night, much like the night we're having in Maine tonight. She came back in saying that she couldn't find the cows. He sent her back out again. And the next day she was found frozen to death, lying beside a fence. This anecdote comes from the history of the towns of Bristol and Bremen, but it doesn't bother to mention the girl's name. So slavery was certainly present in Lincoln County as well as the rest of Maine. And I grew up in Maine. I was educated here through grade 12, but I was never taught anything about these issues. Now, 1783 was a really important year in New England. In September, the American Revolution officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, and slavery ended in Massachusetts, and thus Maine, which was a district of Massachusetts. So how did it end? Well, you might think that it was because some enlightened white legislators saw fit to overturn laws permitting slavery, but that is not what happened. Slavery ended in Maine and Massachusetts because 3 enslaved persons took their cases to court and won. Elizabeth Freeman, pictured here, is one of those. She heard her enslaver, John Ashley, discussing the new Massachusetts Constitution, which of course was written by John Adams. And it said, quote, "All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights." Of course, you hear echoes of the Declaration of Independence there. Though she was illiterate, Elizabeth Freeman believed that the phrase, "all men are born free and equal," pertained to her, and a court agreed. Around the same time, a man named Quock Walker also sued his enslaver and won. And the judge in the case wrote that, quote, "there can be no perpetual servitude of a rational creature." As a result of these trials, enslaved persons began to walk away from bondage, and enslavers knew that if they tried to take them to court, they probably were going to lose. So the 1790 census here, I don't know if you can see it clearly. I have something sort of blocking mine, but
We can see it, Carol.
you can see it, okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the 1790 census, which is the first US census, you'll look across the columns there and you'll see that there are no enslaved persons in Maine or Massachusetts. And those are the only districts where that is the case. There is some evidence, of course, that a few enslaved individuals could be found in Maine after this date, but the practice was on its way out. So in December of 1783, in this very momentous year, 2 formerly enslaved persons, Boston Ruby and Zeruiah Lewis, were married in New Gloucester, Maine. And they're important because we're going to discuss their descendants, who became activists for abolition and civil rights. Now, we don't know the backgrounds of either one of these individuals, but they appear in Maine's marriage records. They appear in the earliest censuses, and I know of at least one of their descendants who still lives here in Maine. So by 1800, we find the Rubies in the next town over, the town of Gray. Okay, so if you look at this map, you see New Gloucester in the upper right corner, and the town of Gray is the green square. Their children, Reuben Ruby and his 4 siblings, were among the first generation of African Americans born free in Maine. Now, in addition to the Ruby family, some 17 other people of color lived in Gray. What do you think these Black families were doing in Gray, Maine, of all places, right? Gray was rural farmland, so they could have been, performing agricultural work. But in 1792, Samuel Mayall established the first water-powered woolen mill in North America on Collier Brook in Gray, launching the Industrial Revolution. You can see a picture of it in the lower right-hand corner here, and actually the red dot is where it's located. I think it's really possible that these Black families found employment at this mill, either helping to build and maintain the buildings, or shearing, carding, and spinning the wool, or whatever, raising the sheep, whatever. Mayall's kind of interesting because he emigrated from England with the technology to build this mill. And the English were not happy about this at all. Okay, they didn't want anybody stealing their technology, going abroad, and competing with them on the woven goods market. So after arriving in Gray, Mayall received 2 packages from abroad. One box contained a brand new hat with pins laced with poison, and another box held pistols that were rigged to fire as soon as the box was open. So 2 very thoughtful gifts from the English. Mayall nevertheless survived, and he went on to build his mill. And you can still see the remains actually on Collier Brook and Gray. I've been out there poking around, and there's still foundations and chimneys there. So Reuben Ruby and his 4 siblings were born free in Maine. But how free were they? Well, 5 years after slavery ended in Massachusetts, the legislature found it necessary to pass a law preventing those of African heritage from being, quote, privately carried off by force or decoyed away with probable intent of being sold as slaves. Blacks were being kidnapped in the North, shipped south, and sold. It was a very common practice throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, known as the reverse Underground Railroad. Some of you might have seen the movie, 12 Years a Slave. There's also a book by Solomon Northrop. He was a free Black, enticed away from his home in upstate New York, taken south, and had to endure slavery for 12 years. He's the tip of the iceberg. Many, many adults and children were kidnapped and sold south. And even if perpetual slavery was outlawed in Maine, servitude was not. So this notice here on the right about a runaway servant is from the Portland Gazette in 1802, 19 years after slavery officially ended. And you'll note that it mentions the physical attributes of this so-called servant girl. She's coal black, she has large eyes, she's thick-made. It even mentions her clothing. But what's missing? Her name is missing. So are you starting to see a pattern here? Without names, people are just so easily erased from the historical record. And what's amazing about this notice to me is that it echoes thousands of runaway notices that were printed in newspapers in the South and in the border states seeking to recover runaways from slavery. But here it is in a Maine newspaper. Now in Maine and Massachusetts, Black individuals were free to marry, free to have children who were free. They could work for themselves or others. They could own property. But they faced segregation and discrimination in housing, schools and churches, ships and stagecoaches, public houses and inns. And they had only limited freedom of movement. Settling in many states was forbidden. And in fact, Massachusetts prohibited Blacks who were not citizens from staying longer than 2 months. In 1800, Boston selectmen warned 239 free Blacks that they must leave. So who was Reuben Ruby? Well, I mentioned that he was born in Gray to 2 formerly enslaved parents. But as a child of 6 or 7, he moved to Portland. And that's when his widowed mother, Zeruiah, married a man named John Lake. Now, Zeruiah and her children were Black, but John Lake and his 2 children were white. And although the laws of Massachusetts forbade interracial marriage at the time, plenty such marriages occurred. Now, perhaps because of his parents having been enslaved, Reuben became one of Maine's most prominent activists, working locally and nationally to bring an end to slavery. He was the first hack driver in Portland. You know, a hack is a term, 19th century term for carriage or cab, right? And you can see his ad here on the right. He was also an operative on Maine's Underground Railroad. And you'll note that his advertisement says that he lives on Preble Street where, quote, he may be found at any time in the night. To me, that's a clear advertisement that if you don't want to be seen or found, I'm your guy, okay? Also, Ruby and several of his African-American neighbors founded the Abyssinian Church here on the left. And it's actually built on Reuben Ruby's former property in Portland. It's the 3rd oldest still standing African-American church in the nation. He helped to found the Maine Anti-Slavery Society, was elected president of the 1835 National Negro Convention. He was a good friend of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. He ran a restaurant in New York City, was president for a while of the Manhattan Anti-Slavery Society, and was a 49er, traveling to California and coming back with several $1,000s worth of gold in 1850. I think that's a tremendous resume for someone born to formerly enslaved parents in Gray, Maine. His sons, too, were illustrious citizens, and I'll talk a little bit about them later. But growing up in Portland, I never heard a word about Reuben Ruby, not in school, not anywhere. Today, though, the good news is that Portland's Freedom Trail has actually erected a plaque at the site of his hack stand. Now, who were the Gordons? Well, Reuben Ruby grew up with two white brothers from the Gardner family. Nathaniel II and his brother William were about the same age. They were within 11 months of Reuben. Brothers Joshua and Morgan Gordon were a bit older. Now they became shipmasters and merchants. And you can see the newspaper ad for William Gordon's store in Portland on the right here, which sold West Indian goods that his brothers and others carried to Maine from the Caribbean. The West Indian trade, as it was called, was really lucrative for Portland and for Maine. We exported a ton of lumber, dried codfish, and meat. And we imported huge amounts of sugar, molasses, coffee, liquor, and cigars. Now, most of the products imported, especially the sugar and molasses, were produced by enslaved persons laboring on large plantations in the heat of the Caribbean sun. So this map is part of Portland's East End. It's just to show you the proximity in which these families live to each other. On Smith Street, if you look up here in the right-hand corner of the map, you'll see Joshua Gordon. That house, he and his brothers were likely raised there. That was his father's property, and he inherited it, and I think that's where the Gordons were raised. Reuben Ruby, you can see a couple of his places here below that. He basically lived in this neighborhood, which was then the Black neighborhood at the foot of Mount Joy or Munjoy Hill. So between, say, the Gordon's house and the waterfront is where between 400 and 800 people of African descent lived. And the vast majority of the men in these families were either sailors or they worked on Portland's docks. Reuben Ruby lived in this neighborhood most of his life when he was living in Portland. Before the 1830s, we know that both white and Black children attended school together in Portland. So I think it's extremely likely that both Reuben and the Gordons attended the North School here, right in between their two homes. We know they attended the same church, which is the Second Congregational down there, sort of in the middle of the map on Middle Street. But at the Second Congregational, the Black families were forced to sit in the balconies and in the far reaches of the building. They couldn't vote in church matters. They were subject to racist comments, and they felt unwelcome. And this is why they decided to build their own church, the Abyssinian. So as Reuben Ruby and Nathaniel Gordon II are reaching adulthood, they're like 22 and 21 years old, Maine petitions to become a state, to break away from Massachusetts. Now, this caused tremendous turmoil in the country and in Congress. You can't, standing here today, we can't imagine what this was like, but it was pretty tough, okay? And if you look at, the problem was, of course, the potential imbalance of free states to so-called slave states. And look what Thomas Jefferson says. He says, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union." So Jefferson is shaking in his boots about this issue, okay? He was really sure that this was going to be the end of the country that he had helped to found. As you might know, Henry Clay persuaded many in Congress to vote for the Missouri Compromise. And the result was that Maine entered the Union as a free state, but it also facilitated the entrance of another slave state, Missouri. Mainers were very divided over the compromise. We had 7 seats in the US House of Representatives at the time. We have only 2 now, okay? Out of those 7, 5 members voted against the Missouri Compromise, and not because they didn't want statehood, because they didn't want slavery to expand. But 2 representatives voted for it, putting it over the top at 90-87. So the Missouri Compromise passed by 3 votes. 2 of those came from Maine, okay? These 2 statements from Portland newspapers show how divided both Portland and Mainers were on the issue. Look at the first one. The labor is over. The mother is delivered. Maine has come into the world with a twin sister, Black as Erebus, deformed as sin, and ugly as Satan. That is the Gazette's description of Missouri, okay? And if you look at the more conservative Eastern Argus, you get a very different take. Well, we're not disposed to examine so critically as we ought the means by which this glorious and happy result has been effected. But, we're not going to regret that Missouri has precisely the same rights as we've always claimed, the right of managing her own concerns. Here are the basics of the two state constitutions. And you can see that they're widely divergent. So the states had plenty of leeway in how they would treat both slavery and free Black citizens. Maine's constitution outlawed slavery, and it authorized African-American men to vote. Missouri's constitution said that the legislature could never outlaw slavery, and free African-Americans could not only not vote, they couldn't even enter the state. Okay. As a result, though, of being able to vote and living in Maine, Reuben joined the Whig Party, and he became politically active. He was one of very, very few Blacks in the nation at the time who could vote. Even many so-called free states found ways of abridging Blacks' voting rights. Let's take New York, for example. They required Blacks to own $250 worth of property, which is roughly $9,000 today, while whites had no such requirements at all. As a result, in 1835, New York City had a Black population of 16,000, but only 68 registered Black voters. Talk about voter suppression. There you have it, okay? Along with the Missouri Compromise came this law, and this is a very important one because we're going to talk about it kind of a lot. The Piracy Act of 1820, which declared that Americans carrying Africans to any other nation to be enslaved was piracy, and it called for the death penalty. Now, there had been other laws against the slave trade ever since 1794. Actually, George Washington signed a law against it in 1794. The difference with the 1820 law is that it made it a capital offense to transport kidnapped individuals. Now, you could still carry enslaved people from one state to another. And my question to you is, why would Southern legislators, most of them slave owners, agree to a law that prescribes the death penalty for carrying Africans into slavery? The disturbing answer is that it made enslaved people in the United States all the more valuable because it cut back on the supply. So enslavers could get much, much more for their investments in human trafficking. I'll say a little bit about this, this image, which is probably the most widely circulated image on the slave trade ever. It was created in 1787 by Thomas Clarkson, the English politician and abolitionist, and it shows an actual slave ship, the Brooks, with 454 people crammed onto 4 so-called slave decks. Now, the Brooks sailed from Liverpool to the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean, where its captives were deposited. And at this point, it's important to remember that Britain was the second largest carrier of enslaved people. And you may be surprised at who was first. Portugal was first. Britain was second. Let's see, Spain, France, Holland, the United States, and Denmark were tied for 6th. So Maine was very divided over the issues of slavery and abolition. Reuben was a proponent for immediate emancipation. Even in the early 1830s, he said, let's end slavery right now. And as such, he was seen as a radical extremist. Morgan Gordon, and likely his brothers, were opposed to immediate emancipation. They wanted to protect the so-called property rights of their Southern brethren, and they felt that abolitionists were tearing the country apart. And towns in cities in Maine were often divided. This chart's a bit of an oversimplification, but certain towns were known to be sympathetic to one side or the other. And if you look at Austin Willie's quote, you'll understand why. Maine's maritime economy was tied up in transporting Southern commodities like cotton and Caribbean commodities like sugar. So shipbuilders, merchants, and captains felt that for their economic well-being, they just couldn't afford to be anti-slavery. And if you think that slavery wasn't a particularly contentious topic in Maine, because we're either too far north or, you know, we don't have slavery or whatever, this list of anti-abolition riots might change your mind. In 1834, abolitionist C.C. Cone spoke in Bath, and a mob broke down the doors and smashed the windows of the building where he was speaking. The attendees had to run for their lives. And the local newspaper announced that, quote, such an assemblage would not be tolerated in the loyal city of Bath. In 1835, Reuben called publicly for immediate emancipation, and a threatening notice was posted against him on the post office door in Portland. At the same time, anti-abolitionists in Portland called a meeting to express their outrage at this idea of immediate emancipation. 100 people attended and signed a petition against it. Morgan Gordon was among them. In 1842, Reverend Austin Willey was speaking in Damariscotta when a mob broke into the building and rushed the stage. Willey had to flee, and he says, you can see here the village resounded as with the yells of demons. This is Damariscotta, people. Okay, right now you go down to Damariscotta, the lights are all out and you won't see anybody. But anyway, so in 1847, Frederick Douglass and Charles Lennox Reuben were speaking at the Friends Meeting House in Portland, and they were stoned and jeered. The Women's Anti-Slavery Sewing Circle had to form a bodyguard around the speakers so that they could leave without being injured. On the other hand, Maine also had a vibrant Underground Railroad. And here are two known safe houses. The Stowe House at the top in Brunswick, where Harriet Beecher Stowe harbored John Andrew Jackson, who escaped from slavery in South Carolina. And he actually wrote a book about his experiences. And then down below on the right, the Dennett House on Spring Street in Portland. And there, Lydia Dennett harbored two very famous fugitives, William and Ellen Craft, and they escaped from Macon, Georgia by a very clever scheme. Ellen was light-skinned, so she pretended to be a man who was sickly and traveling north for medical treatment. William, her husband, pretended to be her slave. And Ellen pretended to have an injured right arm and poor eyesight because neither she nor her husband could read or write. And they wanted to avoid having to sign ship and rooming house registers on their way north. Their book, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, was published in London in 1860. It was a huge hit, a big sensation. And here's a copy of it. And that is actually Ellen that you see. She's dressed in her outfit as a man. You see her, she's wearing sort of darkened glasses, and she has a sling for her arm. Of course, the vast majority of fugitives who passed through Maine were anonymous and unseen because, of course, it was very dangerous. Not only the cost of their becoming known, but the cost of anybody who helped them was terrible. So, and here on the last bullet, these are some Portland families that we know were involved in the Underground Railroad, including the first four, Reuben, Freeman, Manuel, and Pierre. Those were Black families. And the following six, Fessenden, Winslow, Thomas, Dow, Dennett, and Hussey, were white. These families worked closely with one another and collaborated all the time. And some histories have ignored the substantial role that Maine's free Blacks have played in the effort. So this is terrible. The 50s were a disastrous decade for African Americans, and we'll talk about this. This is really pertinent to today too. California was admitted to the Union as a free state through a compromise, much as Maine was. And part of that compromise included the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that all American citizens, north, south, east, and west, had to be involved in capturing fugitives from slavery. So if you failed to report somebody who even might be a fugitive, you could be jailed for 6 months and fined $1,000. And Black persons assumed to be fugitives were not given due process. They were judged by a commissioner. Now, these commissioners, of course, the commissioners are all white. They got $5 for each person declared free and $10 for each person remanded to slavery. That sounds fair, right? So they're actually given a financial incentive to declare that individuals were fugitives. This law was protested throughout the North. Okay, not by everybody, but again, this is divided, but a lot of people were protesting this. Portland created a vigilance committee to warn of slave catchers that might be coming in and to protect any fugitives that might be coming in. And Reuben, of course, was on that committee. But Maine, as a state, resisted too. The legislature declared that local courts could not be used for the purposes of the Fugitive Slave Act, and that county prosecutors had to offer their services to persons declared fugitives at no cost. As if the Fugitive Slave Act weren't bad enough, the Dred Scott decision was handed down in 1857, and it's widely agreed to have been the worst Supreme Court decision of all time. The Dred Scott decision declared that African Americans, free or in bondage, born in the United States or elsewhere, were not citizens, and as such had no rights. So despite being born in Gray, Maine, Reuben, at age 58, was suddenly declared a non-citizen with no rights under the Constitution. Put yourself in his shoes, right? You're 2/3 of the way through your life and suddenly you find you're not a citizen. This is why, a decade later, the 14th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing citizenship to those born in the United States. Because in 1857, an arm of the US government declared an entire class of people non-citizens. And the lesson reverberates today. If this can happen, if there is no birthright citizenship, then who among us is safe? I know I'm not. In the meantime, before the 14th Amendment was ratified, it was ratified after the Civil War. So now we're talking about the years leading up to the war. The Dred Scott decision undermined the Maine Constitution. So the Maine Supreme Court met and they determined that under Maine law, African Americans were bona fide citizens and could not be denied the vote. The fact that citizens and state governments refused to obey federal laws, I think, shows a nation that was coming apart at the seams. And I think it was the North pulling away from the South as much as it was the South pulling away from the North. So now we're going to talk about our second family, and we're going to talk a little bit about the slave trade in Maine. Of course, there are many other slave traders from the state than these two, including other members of the Gordon family. But these were well known. These two guys were well known in their times, and their exploits were covered widely in 19th century newspapers. I just want to say that Nathaniel Gordon III is often referred to as Nathaniel Gordon Jr., but the Gordon family produced at least 4 successive generations of Nathaniel, so it's very confusing. And that's why I give them numbers. And actually, I know a lot of historians who've actually confused Gordon III with his father, Nathaniel Gordon II, who was the contemporary and schoolmate of Reuben. So here they are, Nathaniel Gordon II, okay, again, the contemporary of Reuben, was arrested in 1838 for bringing an enslaved man named George Washington from Guadeloupe into the port of New York. Now, Gordon II was arrested and his ship was seized. But a grand jury failed to indict him because the New York district attorney simply never showed up. So Gordon went free. This was actually typical of trials held in the Southern District of New York at this time. The courts were corrupt. They reflected the mercantile interests of the city, which was the main port for the United States, particularly for sugar and cotton. Nathaniel Gordon II's brother and Gordon III's uncle, Morgan Gordon, made at least one successful slave trip from Africa to Cuba in 1843 with 346 captives. He likely made many more. I haven't found others, but customs officials and even journalists were suspicious of him long before 1843, and you can see it in the newspapers when his ships leave port, that there's some suspicion about what he's doing. And the last 4 bullet points are trips we know Nathaniel Gordon III made, destroying or severely altering the lives of nearly 3,000 Africans. He stole the brig Camargo, which was built in Damariscotta, by the way, and instead of sailing it from San Francisco to New York, as the owner hired him to do, he sailed to Rio de Janeiro, and from there to Africa, and back to Brazil, unloaded his captives, and burned the ship. So this guy is a real pirate, okay? On his last trip, the ship Erie was stopped in the Congo River by the American Anti-Slavery Squadron, and Gordon was arrested. Now, the United States and Great Britain had what they called Africa squadrons, which were Navy ships intended to enforce both nations' laws prohibiting the transatlantic slave trade. You know, the transatlantic slave trade, we have to say, is a big international undertaking, and they're huge criminal syndicates with people from all kinds of different countries. And the United States and Britain were the two, mostly actually Britain was a lot more forceful than even the United States was in trying to stop this trade. Gordon forced his captives, this is why I put this picture here, to sit, not to lie down, as we saw in the image of the slave ship Brooks. They sat spoon fashion with their legs splayed like that, inside the legs of the person behind them and their backs up against their chests. And the question is why? Well, because you could pack more bodies in, right? So you have to imagine sitting like that from 1 to 3 months, which is how long it took for them to cross the Atlantic. And of course, ventilation is poor and there's no sanitary facilities whatsoever. So of course, a significant percentage of captives died on these passages. So in 1860, Gordon, as I said, was captured red-handed in the Congo River by the US Navy Africa Squadron. He had a boat full of captives. He was then brought to New York to stand trial in federal court. Typical of the times, his first trial resulted in a hung jury. But his second trial resulted in a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to death. This was a momentous reversal for federal courts in New York. It was the only such result in United States history. One other slave captain had been convicted in 1857, but his conviction was overturned on a technicality. So in response to this verdict, 18,000 citizens from Maine and 11,000 citizens from New York signed petitions to President Lincoln asking him to commute Gordon's sentence to life in prison. But Lincoln refused, and this is his answer here. He says that, you know, Gordon should relinquish all expectation of pardon by human authority. This was a sensational story in the press for the 2 years that it took to convict Gordon. The bottom drawing is from Harper's Weekly, and it's of Gordon's execution in New York. Now, everybody believes that trading in enslaved persons was very lucrative. It was easy money, you made a lot of money, and that's why people did it. And for some it was, but despite at least 3 successful trips carrying kidnapped Africans whom he sold into slavery, Gordon was penniless at his death. And at the top right, you can see an advertisement for a fundraiser from the New York Herald, okay? And this is after his death, a fundraiser for his wife and orphan child, his widow and orphan child. And it features clowns and circus acts. And then we come to Lincoln County's own Timothy Mayer, okay? The black dot on this map, so this is Whitefield, Maine, and the black dot is where Mayer was raised. His father and mother had emigrated from to Whitefield from Ireland, and there were actually a lot of Irish immigrants in this area. And you can still see a lot of signs of that. In 1835, though, when Timothy was in his 20s, he and several of his brothers moved from Whitefield to Mobile, Alabama to seek their fortunes. By the eve of the Civil War, Mayer owned a large plantation, lumber mill, several steamboats that plied Mobile Bay and Alabama River. And when somebody suggested to him that the Act of 1820 made it impossible to smuggle enslaved persons into the United States, Mayer bet them $1,000 that he could do so. So he purchased the schooner Clotilda. He hired a ship captain named William Foster, who brought 110 captives from present-day Benin and Nigeria into Mobile Bay in July of 1860. Now, they hid the captives in the canebrakes, and Foster had the Clotilda burned in a remote part of the bay. It wasn't discovered until 2019, and you can see the sonar images here on the lower right. Mayer and his brothers and friends enslaved a number of the Clotilda's passengers, and they sold the others. Now, everybody knew that Mayer had done this. The local press reported it. So he was pulled into federal court and charged with bringing individuals into the United States intended for slavery, the penalty for which was death. But the federal judge in his district, William Jones, was Mayer's friend, and Mayer had named one of his steamboats after Judge Jones. And it will come as a big surprise to you, I'm sure, to learn that Judge Jones declared no kidnapped Africans could be found in his district. So Mayer was acquitted. As you can see, justice was meted out very unevenly in the 1850s and 1860s, and I think it's another sign that the country was breaking apart. Well, you may wonder about the captives. I did. And here's one of them that Mayer and Foster brought into the United States from West Africa, Olawale Kosola, also known as Cudjoe Lewis. After 5 years of slavery and civil war, Kosola and the other captives from Dahomey, West Africa, became free. They asked Timothy Mayer, would he pay their passages back to Africa as compensation for all the work they'd done for him? He refused. So these Africans created their own community in Plateau, Alabama, called Africatown, which still exists. They purchased land, they built their own school, and they had their own laws, and many continued to speak in their native tongues. Kosola was among the last surviving individuals to endure the Middle Passage to become enslaved in the United States. And in 1927, the African-American writer Zora Neale Hurston interviewed him, and the book Barracoon resulted here on the lower right. It's a fascinating read. It's told mostly in Kosola's voice, and you can experience the unimaginable havoc wreaked by people like Timothy Mayer on the lives of kidnapped Africans. So now I'm just going to summarize these two Maine families. We've talked about the Rubys and the Gordons, who were on opposite sides of the slavery abolition issue. And they demonstrate not only that Maine was divided, like the nation as a whole, but also that social and political values run in families. Now, we think the top photo is Reuben Ruby. I'm not sure, but I'm 99% sure it's probably him. He looks like his son's down there below. But I've talked enough about his activism. What I want to mention is that his wives, Rachel and Jeanette, and his sister Sophia, were anti-slavery activists in their own right. His son, William, who's in the second picture, right in the middle of the first row, saved the Abyssinian meeting house from the Great Portland Fire of 1866 by climbing up on the roof and covering it with wet blankets. That's why it's still there today. He was also very involved in the Maine Republican Party because, of course, living in Maine, he could actually vote, right? Son George, in the lower left, went south during Reconstruction to teach freedmen and women how to read and write. He was also one of the first two African Americans to be elected to the Texas State Senate. Son Horatio, on the lower right, also went south and became a leader of the Exodusters. And those were African Americans who left southern states for the West to escape the violence and terrorism against them after Civil War and the collapse of Reconstruction. And I think the Gordons also suggest that political beliefs and values and behaviors are passed down through families, since at least 3 members of this family were implicated in the illegal transatlantic slave trade. I'm not going to go over their exploits again. They're here, and I've already recited them, but I do want to add that Morgan Gordon's son, George, a cousin to Nathaniel III, was born and raised in Portland, and he became a blockade runner for the Confederacy during the Civil War. So a strong streak of defiance ran through this Yankee family from Portland, Maine. Now, Maine, as a so-called free state, was full of contradictions. A large proportion of ships used in the slave trade were built here because we actually led the nation in building wooden ships. We produced several of the most notorious slave captains of the 19th century. Our maritime trade was built upon sugar and molasses produced by enslaved laborers in the Caribbean. And Maine citizens were divided over slavery and emancipation. The battles that were being fought between North and South were being fought between neighbors right here. But there's good news. The good news is that in a couple of very important ways, Maine was at the leading edge for modeling equal rights. As long as Maine was a state, Black men were always allowed to vote here, and that right was never abridged. We are one of only 4 states that never abridged or rescinded Black men's voting rights. And when the US Supreme Court declared that African Americans were not citizens and had, quote, no rights that the white man is bound to respect, Maine's Supreme Court responded with this answer. The people of Maine, in exercise of their sovereign power, have conferred citizenship upon those of African descent. Having the required qualifications, they are entitled to vote. And I think there's a lesson here for today as well, that not just individuals, but the state have often effectively resisted the federal government when they felt it wasn't doing justice. The Maine Supreme Court said to the US Supreme Court, we disagree with the Dred Scott decision. We're going to have our own laws regarding African Americans. So I think the states' rights argument can cut both ways, and that can be a good thing. So that's the good news here. And the other really good news I think you'll find is that my talk is over. And if you liked it, I hope you'll purchase my book, which won't be available till April, but at these places, I hope you'll buy local if you can. And I also have an article coming out on Nathaniel Gordon III in the Maine History Journal sometime in summer, so I hope you'll look for that. I just want to thank everybody for attending tonight. I really appreciate it. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Carol. I don't know if you can see on your screen, there's a whole bunch of hearts and clapping emojis. Yeah, so we have a bunch of questions. Jody, do you want to take turns asking questions with me?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. What do you want to go ahead and grab the first? Yep, go ahead.
Maybe I'll start with this. Carol, how did you discover these stories, and what did you get most interested in and surprised by when you were doing your research?
Well, so I love characters, right? And I happened to be, I found Reuben somewhere, I don't know exactly where, in a newspaper or something, or maybe I saw the plaque in Portland, I don't remember. And when I started looking for him in old newspapers, I thought, boy, what a guy. I mean, I kind of fell in love with his character. He was so engaged in issues of justice. He was very litigious. He also sued his own son because he felt his son owed him money and wasn't paying him back. You could just see this person who couldn't stand to be taken advantage of. But he was very altruistic. So he was on the Widow's Wood Committee, which provided wood and fuel for cooking and heating for women who had no other resources. He got help to try and he gave $50 to try and get an African-American from Portland out of jail who had been jailed because of some kind of mutiny on a ship. He pulled all the strings that he could with his white friends to try and get justice for these individuals. And he fought against slavery for most of his life. So I just thought, boy, he's really fascinating. And as I continued looking at his family, it was like a bunch of characters that were all like that. They were just really committed. And then I found that, in fact, Nathaniel Gordon III's father had grown up just 2-3 blocks away from Reuben. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Because a lot of times you hear historians say, well, Maine, it was so far north and so far removed from slavery that people really didn't understand about it. And that's not true at all. The slavery roiled the entire nation, and particularly our culture as a maritime culture was very much immersed in it. So those are the kinds of things that intrigued me.
I want to address one common question that's come up is actually not for you, Carol, but I want to answer it is, yes, this is being recorded. Missed part of it, or you want to go back and review. I wanted to let you know that we are recording this, and we'll send you an email when it's available for watching. The other thing that's come up is I see a couple of folks trying to raise your hands, but we're taking questions only in the Q&A tonight. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little box bottom center that has a question mark in it. It says Q&A, and if you go ahead and type your question there, then we will try to ask it. And for you, Carol, the next one on my screen is, will your book be available as an ebook? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure right away whether it will be. My other book eventually became an audio book, and it was available as an ebook. I honestly don't know, but you know what I'll do? I'll look that up, and I'll put some kind of an answer on my website, which is carolgardnerwriter.com, and that way we can find out.
Thank you.
We have a question about a technical distinction between a servant and a slave, and I may have muddied the waters when I mentioned indentured servant. So can you clarify that for us?
Yeah, well, slavery was forever. That's for starters. And the other thing that's distinct about it is that it was inherited. So, you know, if your mother was a slave, you were born a slave. You were born property of the enslaver, okay? Servitude is very different. Servitude is people in bondage for a certain number of years, a certain length of time. Typically, they get out of it at some point, usually when they reach adulthood, you know. And so that's very, very different. And if you are a servant and you have any children, those children are not automatically enslaved. So it's very, very distinct. And I think, you know, a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people talking about, oh, the Scottish prisoners as slaves, and they weren't, you know, they all got out of their slavery after 7-8 years of servitude. They got out of their indentures after, you know, 7 or 8 years of servitude. But, you know, as I said, slavery was perpetual.
Let's see. Sally wonders, besides Missouri, are you aware of other states that were prohibiting free Blacks from entering?
Oh, dozens. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting thing, and that is in South Carolina. So I mentioned that 25% of U.S. merchant sailors were Black. And when ships would pull into places like South Carolina or New Orleans, those free Blacks had to spend the night in jail. And the ship captains who had hired them on were very frustrated, and they testified before Congress saying, look, we can't have this, because either I have to pay the fine to get them out of jail, or I have to find somebody else who's going to take their place. But no, many southern states persisted in jailing free Blacks should they enter.
Someone wants to know, why do you think more people of color have not moved into Maine communities?
Yeah, well, they have recently. As I said, you know, our population is starting to grow from what it always was. I think in my book, I do talk about how the African-American community in Portland kind of lost its grip on the shipping trade. That the stevedores, when there was this huge influx of Irish immigration after the Great Famine into Portland, it started in the 1840s and continued. The Irish seem to have taken over those jobs. And actually, if you look in the Longshoremen's Union statements at those times, they say that no one of African heritage can be a member of this group. So they really effectively pushed them out. At the same time, Maine was doing a lot of manufacturing, and we had a lot of manufacturing jobs, but most of those jobs were filled by immigrants from Quebec. So I think in Maine, a lot of African Americans left because there simply weren't the jobs here after a while. Early in the century, they had lived in all kinds of rural areas all over the state. And they had been very, as I said, very engaged. You know, Brunswick had many, even in Harpswell, there was a small community there associated with the shipping trade. And but I think those jobs started to dry up for them. And that's what happened.
We have a teacher here, 6th grade teacher, who's asking what resources you might suggest to promote this history. And I'm guessing she might mean within the school system.
Yeah, I wish I knew. I think that one thing that, of course, my book is aimed at an adult audience. But I think one thing that I've noticed is that I didn't learn any of this when I was growing up. So I'm really not sure if there are any resources out there. I will say that when my sons were growing up, they grew up in Maryland, and they did learn about it. They actually read some what are called slave narratives, books written by slaves of their lives, what they endured. And those are really fascinating. I think that's a really terrific way to get started. If they're only reading excerpts, that was really interesting. And I just think looking at some of the, as I said, thinking about the 14th Amendment, why it was passed, I think that's really critical. Most people don't know that. They don't even know what it says. But the fact is that it protects people both born here and naturalized under the Constitution. And we had to have that, because before that was enacted, there was no protection for anybody. We could just declare that, people with red hair weren't citizens. So those are some of the ways I think maybe you can sort of work it into the classroom. But I would take a look at a couple of slave narratives, particularly Harriet Jacobs is one. The book Barracoon that I showed you is another one that I think would really, it might really interest students. So I'd take a look at those.
Thank you, Carol. And in addition, another participant has suggested checking with the Portland schools. She says that the Portland school system has been working on these curriculums.
Yeah, I expect they have. Yeah, not when I was back in Portland, but that was many, many years ago. But I'm glad to hear that they're doing it now. So,
can you remind us where Africa Town is or was?
It's in Plateau, Alabama, and that's not too far from Mobile. If it may actually be a kind of a suburb of Mobile. Yes, and that that's really interesting. That came up because as I say, they found the ship in 2019, I believe, and it suddenly was discovered, and it was in the news a lot. So if you look online, I'm sure you'll find pieces about it in National Geographic and all kinds of newspapers. And there's even a person who's written a book about the whole ordeal. And there's a really wonderful book called Dreams of Africa in Alabama by Sylviane Diouf. And it's wonderful because she's so detailed about the whole episode that it's really, really interesting. I also say about another ship. I mentioned the Camargo that Nathaniel Gordon III stole, and then he had burned and scuttled in Brazil. Well, they think they may have found that. They're working on trying to make sure that that's what it is. But if that actually is identified conclusively, I think there's going to be kind of an explosion of media about it. And as I said, that's a ship that was built right down the road from me here. So that's interesting.
Somebody's wondering if you know who built the ship.
Yeah, I think it was built in the shipyard of a man named Cyrus Cotter, who, as I say, down here on the Damariscotta River. So I actually have another presentation that of 3 ships that were built in 1846 in Newcastle and Damariscotta. And all 3 ended up in the slave trade, just from this small little village down here. So it was quite an interesting time. They didn't actually build the ships as slave ships. You didn't go down to the shipyard and say, look, I want to buy a ship to carry slaves. They're enslaved persons. You didn't do that. But they ended up in the slave trade because they were purchased, refitted, retrofitted, etc., because there was so much money and activity going on. So it's not surprising that so many, Maine was, as I said, we led the nation in shipbuilding at the time, and it's not surprising that so many of our ships did end up in the trade.
Carol, one person is asking, what were the other states that never disenfranchised Blacks?
Oh yeah, that's you probably can guess. It's kind of like the United States of Northern New England. It's Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts.
We have a couple of specific to the area questions. You said a hussy was involved in the Underground Railroad. Do you remember which hussy? Related to Thankful, who married Joseph Southwick,
Yeah,
be connected to the Female Anti-Slavery Society in Salem.
I think it was Thankful's father or grandfather. Okay, off the top of my head, I can't tell you. But again, if you contact me through my website, carolgardnerwriter.com, I'll be sure to answer that question. But it's either her father or her grandfather who lived in Portland. He was a Quaker, and he had a deal with a jailkeeper in Portland. I don't know whether he was paying him or what, but if fugitives ended up in the jail down there, they would get them out, and the hussies would get them out and would either put them on boats to go to Nova Scotia or, you know, whatever, to go to Europe, wherever. So they were very active in the Underground Railroad, the whole hussy family. And I think one of the women, one of the daughters, wrote a memoir about it and about all of the stuff that they did in the abolition movement. That's kind of interesting.
Wow.
The next question that's local is, are you familiar with the participation of the Child Brothers of Bristol and New Harbor in the slave trade?
Oh, no, I'm not. I'd be interested in hearing more about that again. So if you want to write me, I'd be really anxious to hear it. The truth is that it's so, there's so many that it's hard to keep up with all of them. Do you folks know Kate McMahon? And she does, you know, she's sort of collected all kinds of information on slave ships from Maine and their owners and the captains who captained the ships. And I think she's found at least 70 just from the state of Maine. So it's a number that's hard to keep up with unless you're right on top of it. But she's a better person, probably would know better than me the answer to that question.
Kate McMahon, you said.
Yeah.
Great.
She works for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And she's a member of Atlantic Black Box.
Okay. I'm just wondering, you were talking about the fact that there were the 3 slaves who sued their enslavers in Maine. But that didn't happen in the South?
No, that was in Massachusetts, actually.
Or I'm sorry, in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
But even though that was possible to do, nobody in the South did that? Is there a particular reason why?
I'm just not aware of anyone that did. Again, I focused in on a very small area. And I think this was these were such momentous lawsuits for Maine and Massachusetts that I just found them really interesting. There were all kinds of lawsuits. I mean, I must say that African Americans did use the courts. Whether enslaved people used the courts a lot or not, I'm not sure. But the Dred Scott decision came from an enslaved man whose enslaver carried him out to the Midwest. He got married. The enslaver went back to the South. Dred Scott stayed out there. His enslaver died. His wife remarried, and then the new husband and the wife said, "Oh, you're our property." And so Dred Scott took it to court and said, "No, I've lived in a free state. Once I've lived in a free state, I'm a free man." And of course, that was taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you are nothing in our eyes. I mean, it's a very, 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 I don't know how people live through that decision. But so there's an example of a Southern person doing a lawsuit.
Okay.
I think that do we have time for one more question maybe?
Sure.
We're getting close to the end here. how about, did the American Colonization Society have any impact in Maine politics? Is that something you could speak to?
Well, actually, it did a little bit. The American Colonization Society was a group that was founded in the 19th century, and the idea was to get African Americans who were free to go to majority Black countries where they would feel even more free. And there's also some thought that maybe somehow they would sort of, ease the racial tensions here at home if they did so. So there were a lot of places, and actually Abraham Lincoln was actually for this. Okay, he said to a group of African Americans that, we know we don't live together very well. We don't like living together very well. I think it would be better if you guys went away to a place that was a majority owned. And he sent, I don't know, some 400 people. I forget whether it was to Haiti or whatever. So it did have some impact. I will say that John Brown Rushworm, who was a graduate of Bowdoin College, an African-American graduate of Bowdoin College, the third person to graduate, Black person to graduate from college in the United States, actually ran one of those colonies in Africa. So he wrote his thesis on, these majority Black countries like Haiti that had fought for its own independence. And he went to Africa and served in a government capacity there in Liberia, and also in what was called, the colony was called Maryland in Africa. So it did have